They thought it was just a bench, a quiet seat at the edge of a mountain trail. But when a group of teens defaced the plaque meant for a 12-year-old boy named Caleb, they didn't just vandalize wood, they shattered something sacred. What happened? Next didn't come with shouting or revenge, but with tools, silence, and a father no one had seen in years. This isn't just a story about loss, it's about what communities remember, what they rebuild, and how one bench became a movement that stretched far beyond one town and one boy. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. It was early April when the snow finally gave up its grip on Walker's Ridge Park. The pine needles, slick from thaw, clung to the path, and the stream beside the East Trail burbled again with meltwater. Spring in Dry Fork, Montana didn't. Arrive in a rush it, crept in on the heels of silence, reclaiming ground slowly, without ceremony. At the far end of the park, away from the playground and the baseball field, past a cluster of tall spruce and a weathered wooden sign, sat a bench. It faced the valley, positioned where the sunlight lingered longest before dipping behind the mountains. The bench was nothing extravagant, just planks of old timber, sanded and bolted into a frame. The grain was coarse and uneven in spots, and the screws that held it together were mismatched, some silver, some copper, all reused. But it was sturdy, and the backrest bore a brass plaque, slightly dulled from snow and time. It read, "For Caleb, you are still loved." No last name, no dates, no explanations. Just that, most people passed it in silence. Runners nodded to it. Dog. Walkers paused beside it. Some sat, some didn't, but everyone in town knew what it was. And more importantly, everyone knew who it was for. Caleb had been 12, bright-eyed, curious, the kind of kid who asked questions adults didn't know how to answer. His favorite spot had always been that clearing above the ridge, where he said the clouds looked like stories drifting across the sky. When he died suddenly, in a way that no one liked to talk about, his father disappeared into the mountains and didn't come back. Not right away, not for the funeral, not for the casseroles. But 3 weeks later, the bench appeared. No announcement, no GoFundMe, just the bench. And no one dared to move it. But that morning, with the sky a bright, careless blue and the wind shaking loose the last crusts of winter ice, someone did more than move it. A group of teenagers, 4 boys and a girl, came swaggering down the trail, the way teenagers often do when there's no one watching and too much afternoon left to waste. They kicked pebbles and threw pine cones and laughed at nothing in particular, the kind of laughter that rolls over things without thinking. One of them spotted the bench. "What's this? Someone die or something?" he said, squinting at the plaque. Another laughed. For Caleb, he read aloud, in a mock solemn voice, "You are still loved." That's so dramatic. Was he like a dog? The girl half smiled but said nothing. The others kept walking, but one stayed behind. He ran his hand along the backrest and tapped the plaque with his knuckle. Then he pulled a pocket knife from his jeans. He didn't say anything, just scratched something small into the underside of the seat. 3 letters, crude and shallow, but visible. Then he spat in the dirt and jogged to catch up with the rest. Garrett saw it happen. She'd been standing just out of sight, near the old trailhead sign, 74 years old and quiet as snowfall since her stroke 2 years ago. She carried a notebook everywhere now and scribbled what she couldn't. Say her right hand still worked, her voice didn't, so she watched and wrote, her fingers trembling as they formed the words, bench, Caleb, knife. 4 boys, 1 girl, scratched letters. April 9th, 2:47 p.m. She tore out the page and folded it neatly into her coat pocket. Then she walked to the bench and sat, ran her hand over the letters that didn't belong. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself cry not loud, but long. Because in Dry Fork, there were things you didn't touch, and that bench was one of them. Caleb didn't leave behind a lot of things, at least not in the way grown-ups usually mean. There were no trophies on a shelf, no science fair ribbons, no framed certificates or medals, but he left impressions in tree bark where he'd carved little frogs in muddy footprints beside the creek. In the sound of a laugh that still echoed in some people's heads whether they admitted it or not. He was 12 when it happened, though most people still said just 12, as if the word just could somehow soften the reality of it. He was a curious kid, the kind who would squat in the grass for a full hour, just to watch a line of ants carry crumbs, the kind who asked his father why lightning didn't go sideways, and who once tried to rescue a beetle from a spider's web using a twig and a cup of orange juice. He didn't play sports, not really, though he'd tried. Little League once. His glove was always too big, his hat never stayed on, and he was more interested in staring at clouds than tracking a fly ball. He loved frogs. Not in the way some kids say they love things, then forget them a week later. No, Caleb knew the difference between leopard frogs and wood frogs, knew where they liked to hide, how they moved when they were scared. He had a notebook filled with drawings and names. His own made-up classification system that probably didn't mean anything to anyone but him. And fire trucks, well, that was a different kind of love. He used to count the seconds it took for the fire station to open its doors. During drills, he knew every model the town owned, and once begged the chief to let him sit behind the wheel. He got that wish on his 11th birthday, and there's a photo somewhere of him grinning so wide his cheeks nearly swallowed his eyes. That picture ended up in the town newsletter when he passed. People said it showed his spirit. People say things like that when they don't know what else to say. He'd wave to hikers from the bend in the trail above the ridge, always from the same rock, legs swinging, hair stuck to his forehead. Some thought he was odd. Others just saw a lonely kid with too much time. But those who stopped and talked to him really, walked away, changed. He had that kind of effect. Not loud, not in your face, just present. Listening when most people didn't. His death wasn't the kind with sirens or headlines, it was quiet. Sudden, a heart defect no one saw coming. He collapsed on a school field trip just outside the boundary rope near the river overlook. One minute he was pointing out a bird's nest to a classmate, the next he was on the ground, eyes open but already far away. The teachers did everything right. The paramedics came fast, but sometimes fast isn't enough. The town didn't talk about it much afterward. The school planted a tree. The PTA offered to buy a plaque for the hallway. But that didn't feel right to his father. He didn't want Caleb memorialized in a building with fluorescent lights and bell schedules. He wanted him remembered where the sky felt open. The bench was built 2 months later. Trevor Wallace, Caleb's father, didn't ask for help, but it came anyway. Pete Donnelly from the sawmill dropped off scrap oak. Mrs. Lang from the hardware store handed over wood stain without charging. Even young Connor Bailey, who once told Caleb frogs were gross, showed up to sand the armrests. It came together over a weekend. People who didn't always talk to each other, working without saying much, passing tools and standing side by side. They used old fence posts for the legs, a barn plank for the seat. The backrest was shaped from salvaged wood from a collapsed picnic shelter. On the underside, hidden from view, someone etched a short message in blocky letters. He mattered. The brass plaque came last. For words, no dates, no explanations, just a message for anyone willing to read it. Caleb didn't leave behind trophies or ribbons, but the bench, that was his. And anyone who sat on it if they listened. Just right might still hear a boy naming clouds or calling frogs, by names only he understood. The afternoon had that restless kind of warmth, the kind that comes just after a storm clears, but before the ground remembers it's supposed to dry. The clouds had broken into long trailing streaks, and the sun filtered through in uneven patches that danced across the gravel path like flickering lanterns. The park was mostly empty, except for the sound of wind shaking the branches and a distant dog. Barking at nothing in particular, they came up the trail in a lazy cluster, half walking, half shoving each other for boys and a girl all around. 16 or 17. The age where everything feels like it's yours for the taking, and nothing has consequences until it does. Their sneakers scuffed against the edges of the trail, knocking loose small stones that skittered into the ditch. One of the boys had a speaker clipped to his backpack, pumping out music that clashed with the silence around them. They laughed. Too loudly, not because anything was especially funny, but because they could. They weren't from around here, not exactly. Maybe one or two of them had family in town, or had spent a summer at someone's cabin. But they didn't move like the locals did, didn't soften their footsteps or nod politely when passing by. They moved through the space like it was empty, like whatever they touched would bend to them. The girl wore a flannel tied around her waist and gum-popped her way through most of the hike. She didn't say much, but her eyes followed the others. Carefully, like she wasn't sure where the line was, but didn't want to be the one to find it first. The tallest boy, the one with shaggy blonde hair and a chipped tooth, stopped when he spotted the bench. "Well, would you look at this?" he said, kicking a small pine cone out of the way. "VIP seating for squirrels." The others gathered around. One sat right on top of the backrest, like it was a bike rack. Another sprawled across the bench, limbs hanging off like he didn't care where they landed. Someone laughed, not a joyful kind of laugh, the other kind, the kind that tests the air. "It's say," one of them asked, pointing at the plaque. The blonde kid squatted to read it, aloud in a mock-dramatic voice. "For Caleb, you are still loved." He paused, then added, "Well, guess not by us." The others snorted, and one of them mimicked, sobbing. "Poor little Caleb. Boo-hoo!" The girl didn't laugh. She chewed her gum slower, looked toward the trail, then back again. "Maybe we should chill," she said quietly, but the moment had already turned. Blonde boy pulled a pocket knife from his Genza cheap, folding thing with a faded camo pattern and a notch in the blade. He flipped it open with a flick more flourish, then function, and tapped the edge against the plaque. "Think I should add something, in case he forgot he was loved." The others egged him on with oohs and nudges, and no one stopped him. He pressed the knife into the brass, scratching. At the edge of the engraving, the sound wasn't loud, but it was sharp. A scraping noise that cut through the wind and landed heavy in the chest. He didn't carve anything meaningful, just a line, a small arc that broke the symmetry of the letters. It wasn't about the mark. It was about the fact that he could. "Now he's really remembered," he said with a smirk, sheathing the knife. They left the bench like it was just another log or railing. The music kicked up again as they moved down the trail, still laughing, still loud. The bench stood quiet behind them, the sun glinting off the scratched metal. The plaque wasn't ruined, but it wasn't whole anymore either. And in a place like Walker's Ridge, where silence is sacred and memory runs deeper than time, that kind of laughter didn't echo it, just hung in the air like a bruise that hadn't bloomed yet. Martha had been coming to Walker's Ridge every morning for nearly 20 years, long before the stroke took her voice, long before the town expanded past the lumberyard and the kids started carrying phones instead of fishing poles. Officially employed anymore hadn't been for a while, but people still called her the groundskeeper. It was her bench that greeted early joggers, her rake that cleared the fallen pine needles off the path, her quiet hands that gathered the wind-blown litter no one else noticed. The stroke had come on a cold Thursday in November. She remembered it not for the pain, but for the sound she couldn't make when the words got trapped behind her teeth. One minute she was filling a bird feeder, the next she was kneeling in the frost, breath short, hands twitching, unable to call for help. It had taken nearly an hour before someone found her. Her voice never came back. These days she carried a small notepad in her coat pocket, a plain wire-bound thing with thick paper and a pencil loop. It wasn't for writing poetry or thoughts. It was for details, license plates of suspicious trucks, odd changes in the trails, flowers blooming early. She noted things others overlooked, a habit she had long before her stroke and one that remained even now. Sharpened by silence, she was trimming the overgrowth near the trail sign that afternoon, crouched low with pruning shears and gloves that were worn but serviceable. Her cap shaded her eyes, but she didn't miss much. When she heard the laughter, sharp, aimless, too loud for the setting, she straightened and stepped behind a tree for cover. She didn't recognize the teens, not by name, but their body language said enough. They didn't walk like the others, didn't tread lightly. She watched them surround the bench. Her bench, she sometimes thought, though it wasn't hers at all. She'd helped install it. Had knelt beside Caleb's father that day with a level and a mallet, had held the screws while he bolted the legs into place. She hadn't known Caleb well. He was a polite boy, the kind that waved even when he didn't expect a reply, but she'd seen him enough to understand why the bench had ended up exactly there, where the view broke open and the air always smelled of pine. When the blonde boy pulled out the knife, Martha stepped forward instinctively, then stopped. Her hand reached toward her throat out of old habit, a useless reflex that still hadn't faded. No voice came, just the ache of the words she could never shout, "Don't." She watched, instead, every movement etched into her mind. The boy's grip on the knife, the flick of the wrist, the way the others shifted from uneasy to amused, riding the wave of someone else's boldness, and the girl always a step behind, her arms crossed, chewing her lip instead of laughing. After they left, Martha remained in place for a long moment, feeling the cold creep through her knees. Then she stepped out from the trees and walked slowly. To the bench, her breath came harder now than it used to, and her gait was uneven. But she moved with purpose. She ran her hand over the plaque. The scratch wasn't deep, but it was there. A sharp wound across the word loved. She blinked slowly, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her notepad. She wrote in blocky, firm letters, "For teens, 1 girl. Blonde boy, had knife, scratched plaque. 3:18 p.m. Thursday." She tore the page carefully, folded it into thirds, and tucked it into the envelope she kept in her satchel for things that mattered. It wasn't the first note she'd written like that, and lately it felt like it wouldn't be the last. Martha sat on the bench beside the scar. She looked out across the valley, where the light had begun to soften into early evening gold. She couldn't say what needed to be said, but she could watch, and she could write, and that, for now, was enough. The Dry Fork post office wasn't much to look at, a squat brick building with faded blue trim and a sagging flag out front. But it was where everything passed through, even the things that didn't come with stamps. It sat at the junction of Main and Sycamore, right between the old pharmacy and the barber shop, with the cracked front window that no one had gotten around to fixing. Inside, the linoleum curled at the corners, and the air always smelled faintly of ink and heating oil. The mail slots were labeled with names that had been there for decades. Alverson, Meeks, Leland Green. The woman behind the counter, Mrs. Doris Kinney, ran the place like a school teacher who'd never retired. She knew everyone's birthdays and funerals, which dog belonged to which truck, and how much gossip could fit between 2 envelopes. It started small, like most things do. A murmured comment from Martha Garrett's niece, who stopped in to pick up her aunt's pension check. She was a quiet woman, the type who didn't say much unless she was sure it mattered. That morning, she said just 10 words while handing over a signed slip. Someone scratched the plaque on Caleb's bench. A knife. Doris blinked, paused with her hand on the cash drawer. "Are you sure?" She wrote it down. "Left it on the table this morning. For teens, 1 girl. Blonde boy had a knife." The slip of paper was barely cold when it was passed first to Harold McKay, who ran the bait shop, then to Bev Mitchell from the quilting group, then to Jean up at the garage. No one raised their voice. No one marched into the sheriff's office or pounded their fist on a counter. But the question echoed quietly from porch to porch, coffee shop to church basement. Did you hear what they did to the bench? It wasn't said with outrage, not yet. It was said like a bruise that had just begun to darken quiet, uneasy, real. By mid-afternoon, Caleb's name was on everyone's lips again, though few said it directly. Instead, they spoke in shortened phrases and knowing looks. They touched it. Someone muttered at the hardware store. "Scratched it, I heard," came the reply from a customer flipping through seed packets. Mrs. Evans, who hadn't been seen at the park in months, showed up at the coffee shop and sat for an hour without ordering anything. She just listened, stirring an empty mug. She'd been Caleb's Sunday school teacher at the town library. A retired English teacher asked the librarian if there was a book on restoration of brass surfaces. When asked why, she just said, "For something important." Even the Sheriff David Dorsey caught wind before sundown. He'd been walking through the market when a young boy tugged at his jacket and whispered, "They broke Caleb's bench." The boy wouldn't say who told him. Sheriff Dorsey just nodded and made a note in his pocket ledger, even though no formal report had been filed by early evening. People were walking past the park who didn't usually bother. Couples on their second walk of the day, dog owners, with dogs that didn't need a second trip. No one stayed long, they just looked. At the bench, at the scratch, at the empty space beside it where the plaque had been temporarily removed by someone with good intentions but no announcement. The bench itself said nothing. It never had, but the absence of its quiet dignity, its untouched simplicity, was louder than any news bulletin. "Did you hear what they did to the wench?" The phrase moved like a wind across town. Not fast, not sharp, just steady. The way grief moves, the way memory does. And in Dry Fork, both had a long reach. The cabin wasn't on any official map, not really. If you asked, folks would just gesture vaguely toward the ridgeline and say, "Up past the third switchback, where the pines thin out." No one had seen smoke from the chimney in weeks, but no one assumed that meant he was gone. He knew how to make a fire disappear, just as easily as he knew how to start one. Some said he built the place himself. After the funeral, others claimed it had been there already, a leftover from a mining foreman or a forest ranger who didn't come back. But everyone agreed on one thing. That's where Trevor Wallace went when he stopped coming to town. That's where he stayed. Still talked about him, especially in whispers, and especially since the bench had been scratched, he's up there alone. Someone said at Roy's Diner, pushing around a half-a-toned piece of pie. Living on canned food and creek water, probably. I heard he has trail cameras. Watches the edge of his land like a hawk. He's not the same since Caleb. Not since the boy. People remembered the funeral, or what there was of it. Trevor hadn't come. Michelle, Caleb's mother, had stood alone by the casket, her face like paper left out in the rain. No one asked where he was. Some assumed he'd gone back to the service, back to the desert or jungle, or wherever they send men like him. But no, he'd just gone up, into the trees. He hadn't always been this way. Before Caleb died, he coached the local fire cadets once a month, showed them how to build shelter, start a fire with wet kindling, read a topographical map. He'd been easy to spot around town tall, built like a freight hauler, with arms inked in faded military emblems, and one leg that never quite moved the way it should. He limped, but didn't apologize for it. People respected that Trevor never said much, but when he did, people listened. He wasn't the shouting type. He had that kind of quiet that came from seeing more than he ever said. You didn't get to hear his war stories unless you earned them, and most people never did. Caleb had been his shadow. From the time the boy could walk, he'd followed Trevor around like he was tethered by invisible string asking questions, mimicking his movements, absorbing everything. When other kids played video games, Caleb sat on the porch learning knots. He once spent a full afternoon trying to balance a compass needle on his thumb, just because his dad said it helped with steadiness. Then came the silence. After the funeral, Michelle left town. No one blamed her. A sister out in Boise took her in. She didn't leave forwarding information, just a short note left with the pastor. "Tell Trevor I couldn't stay." He never responded. Some say he spends his days carving. Others think he keeps journals-thick notebooks filled with coordinates, sketches of trees, memories no one else wants to hold. The limp's still there, though, a slow drag step that marks his path through the brush, if you know what to look for. Once or twice, someone spotted him coming into town late at night. To the feed store, the gas station, once to the church, where he sat in the last pew and left before the benediction. No one approached him. They knew better, so when word reached the timberline that something had happened to Caleb's bench, one knew how he'd take it. But everyone agreed he would take it personally, because whatever grief had turned Trevor Wallace into a shadow, it hadn't made him forget, not the boy, not the bench, and not the town that kept both alive in whispers. The scratch on the plaque was just the beginning. That much was clear by Saturday morning. When Martha's note reached Sheriff Dorsey's desk and he made his way up to Walker's Ridge with Corporal Grant in tow, the morning was colder than it looked, the sky a pale wash that threatened rain but never followed through. Dorsey didn't speak on the drive up. He hadn't said much since he'd first heard the whispers in the market aisle, or when Doris Kinney handed him the envelope, with Martha's name penciled on the back. He read her words once in the cruiser, once again before stepping out, and didn't need to ask any more questions. They walked the trail in silence, boots crunching over gravel and last year's pine needles. When they reached the bench, the light was just filtering through the trees in wide columns, catching on the rough surface of the seat. The plaque had been temporarily removed. Someone had taken it off in hopes of fixing the damage. But the real harm hadn't been to the plaque. It was what lay beneath. On the underside of the bench seat, tucked in the dark strip of wood, where few would think to look, was a series of words carved in jagged lines. Not deep, but deliberate. Dorsey crouched slowly, his knees creaking, and tilted his head to get a clearer view. He didn't have to read the whole thing to understand the intent. Better off dead, LOL. The letters were rough, carved with a small blade or something sharp, and narrow. The last part, those three characters, a smirking face carved like punctuation, felt like a slap. Not just vandalism, but mockery. Not just teenage rebellion, but cruelty. Grant stepped forward behind him, squinting. "You want me to get up?" Photo Dorsey didn't answer at first. He ran his fingers gently over the carved grooves, then pulled his hand back as if they'd burned him. He stood slow, the motion heavy in his shoulders. "Take the photo," he said, voice low, "but don't post it in the system yet. Not until I've talked to the Wallace boy's father." Grant hesitated. "You sure he needs to see this?" Dorsey gave a small nod, eyes still on the bench. "I don't think need's got anything to do with it." Word had spread about the scratch on the plaque, but this felt different. This wasn't just defacing a nameplate or laughing at something sacred. This was personal. And anyone who knew Caleb, even a little, would feel the sting of those words as if they'd been written to them. The sheriff didn't have kids. Never did. But he'd watched Caleb grow from the kind of boy who tied his shoes in double knots to the kind who remembered birthdays that weren't his. He remembered the time Caleb had brought him a frog in a shoebox, wide-eyed, explaining that it had been injured and needed a place to rest until it got better. The frog didn't make it, but Caleb had buried it himself. Marked the spot with a rock and a stick. Better off dead. Dorsey swallowed something bitter in his throat. Not the words themselves, but the fact that someone had put them there and walked away. He pulled out his notebook, one he hadn't used in a while, and jotted down the details. Exact wording, knife marks, depth of etching, the facts, plain as he could write them. They left the bench untouched for the moment. No tape, no signs, just silence. As they walked back toward the cruiser, the wind picked up slightly, rustling through the trees as if carrying the words, away though not far. Words like that didn't just vanish. They stuck to the bark, to the air, to memory, and somewhere, up past the third switchback, a man in a cabin stirred. The plaque came off the bench on a gray morning, one of those in-between days when the sky seemed unsure whether to snow or rain. It had been done gently, with a screwdriver and gloved hands, by someone who didn't want to make a scene. No official. Notice was posted, no announcement made. But by noon, word had already passed from the post office to the diner, from the diner to the fire station, and from there to just about every house along the edge of Walker's Ridge. Bare, its backrest smooth and empty where the brass had once glinted in the sun. To anyone new, it might have looked like just another seat in the park. Nothing to notice. But to those who had been walking that trail for months or even years, it was a quiet shock. Like returning to a room and finding the photo frames removed. From the mantel, the walls wiped clean of memory. People still came to the park at first. A jogger or two passed by in the morning, their footsteps softer than usual. A couple walking their dog paused at the fork in the trail, glanced toward the bench, then continued in the other direction. No one sat there, not now, not without the plaque. By the second day, fewer visitors made their way up the trail. By the fourth, the only footprints near the bench were from squirrels and one old pair of boots that belonged to Martha Garrett, who continued her rounds despite the weather. Her notepad tucked inside her coat. She didn't stop to sit anymore. She simply walked past it, glanced once, then moved on. The absence of that small piece of metal became more than symbolic. It became a kind of ache. The plaque had anchored the space, given people permission to feel something when they passed. Without it, there was nothing to focus on, just empty wood. The memory was still there, but it had nowhere to land. At Roy's Diner, customers asked Doris if she knew when the plaque would be replaced. She only knew that Sheriff Dorsey had handed it off to someone with experience restoring metals, and that it was being cleaned, not discarded. That was the word she used, cleaned. But everyone understood what she meant. "You can't clean grief," one man muttered over his coffee. No one disagreed. At the elementary school, a teacher who had once taught Caleb art noticed that his name, once scribbled in permanent marker on a corner of the supply closet, had been accidentally wiped away during a recent repaint. She didn't tell anyone. Just stood there a moment longer than usual, hand on the doorframe, in the library. Someone checked out 3 books on woodwork restoration, and another asked quietly if there was any record of Caleb's poems. There weren't. He hadn't written them down, he'd spoken them aloud, mostly to himself or to the trees, as his mother once recalled. Even the church felt it. On Sunday, Pastor Fields made a vague reference in his sermon to the small things that hold us together, and several people nodded with downcast eyes, knowing exactly what he meant without needing the name. It wasn't outrage that settled over Dry Fork. It was something heavier, a stillness that pressed into the routines of everyday life, like the weight of snow that hasn't fallen yet but is coming. The town didn't shout. It never had. But it had grown quiet in a different way. Less talk, fewer gatherings, more long glances at the horizon that held the timberline where the boy's father lived. The bench remained, sturdy, unchanged in structure, but altered nonetheless. A hollow in plain sight. Not vandalized anymore, not yet repaired, just incomplete. People said nothing as they passed it, but they slowed. And then, more and more, they stayed away. Jack Rollins didn't talk much about the Marines anymore, not since his knees began locking up in the cold and the pain in his hip made him grunt when he got out of bed. He'd spent most of his adult life trying to move forward, first through the service, then into carpentry, then into the quiet retirement he'd thought he'd earned. But some ties don't dissolve, no matter how much time passes. Some men stay tethered by something deeper than memory. He packed light for the hike, just a battered thermos filled with black coffee, a roll of gauze in case the trail bit back, and a folded piece of paper with a name he didn't need to read. The air thinned the higher he climbed, pine and snow mixing in the wind, the earth soft in places where spring melt had loosened the ground. It had been over a year since he'd made the climb to Trevor Wallace's cabin. Longer still, since they'd spoken without weight, hanging in the space between every sentence. Trevor had never been easy. Even in their squad, the man was quiet, to the point of vanishing. Reliable as steel, but never one to share. He carried his own pain and didn't ask anyone else to carry it with him. But when Caleb was born, Jack saw something shift. Trevor started smiling more, started coming to town, letting the edges soften. It didn't last. When the boy died, Trevor disappeared like smoke, back into the timberline, where he didn't have to explain anything. Jack understood that too, maybe too well. It was midday by the time he reached the clearing. The cabin stood solid, small but deliberate logs stacked with precision, a tin chimney that gave off no smoke. Jack paused, letting his breath catch, then stepped up to the porch and knocked twice with the flat of his palm. No answer came. He waited, then opened the screen door slowly and called out, "Trevor, it's Jack." A minute passed. Then the door creaked open. Trevor stood in the frame. Shoulders broader than Jack remembered, beard longer and streaked with gray. He wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled and an old Marina shoe sidearm at his hip. His eyes were as still as ever. "Didn't think I'd see you up here," he said. Jack held up the thermos like a peace offering. "Didn't think you'd be the type to go this long without decent coffee." Trevor stepped aside without speaking. The cabin smelled of cedar and dust with a faint trace of gun oil. There were no photographs on the walls, just a map above the fireplace and a set of carved wooden tools on a narrow shelf. Jack poured the coffee into tin mugs and set one on the table. He didn't sit yet, just stood there, holding the cup in both hands. "They touched the boy's bench," he said finally. Trevor looked up, but didn't move. "They scratched the plaque cut in two. The seat. Sheriff found something carved underneath." Nasty words. The silence that followed wasn't blank. It was charged. Like something pulled tight, just shy of breaking dot, Trevor set his mug down without drinking. He walked to the window and stared out toward the trees. The limp in his right leg was worse than Jack remembered. Was it kids? He asked. Jack nodded. Slowly, teens. Just stupid enough to do it, not smart enough to understand what it meant. Trevor's shoulders rose and fell. They think it's forgotten. That he's forgotten? No, Jack said. They just didn't know who they were hurting. Not really, but the town knows. And they're waiting. Trevor turned, and for a long moment, the two men stood across from each other. Brothers. Once, in war. Strangers now, bound by the memory of a boy who used to laugh at frogs and wave at hikers. "I'll come down tomorrow," Trevor said. Jack didn't ask what for. He only nodded and sat down, finally drinking the coffee that had gone cold. The snow returned that night in a thin, whispering veil, drifting down past the pines and dusting the roof of the cabin like a quiet warning. It wasn't enough to bury anything, not yet, but it covered the paths and softened the trees. And when morning came, The world below the timberline looked just a little more distant, the kind of snow that made a man take pause not for the cold, but for the clarity it brought. Trevor didn't rush. He never had. He woke before dawn, as he always did, stirred the stove to life, and sat at the small table with a cup of coffee that tasted more like ritual than warmth. The bench had appeared in his dreams again, just the wood and the brass and Caleb's voice echoing without words. Not a memory, exactly more like a tug, the kind that settles in the chest and refuses to leave. By the time the sun began slicing its way through the clouds, Trevor had laced up his boots. Not the everyday ones he'd worn through 3 tours and 3 funerals, with the creases around the ankles and the stitching frayed just enough to tell a story. He stood by the stove and held them for a moment in both hands before sliding them on. There was no ceremony to it, just readiness. Then he opened the chest. It sat beneath his workbench, mostly untouched for the past year. Not because he couldn't bear it, but because he hadn't known what to do with what it held. Inside were the tools wrapped in old oilcloth, edges dulled from time but still sharp enough where it mattered. A set of chisels, a wood plane, a folding square, and the knife Caleb had once tried to copy in the shape of a crayon drawing. Trevor ran his thumb along the handle, where the boy's initials had once been etched into soft pine as practice. He placed the tools on the bench one by one. No hesitation, no muttering, just movement, steady and sure, like muscle remembering what the mind had tried to forget. Outside, the wind pressed lightly against the shutters. A crow called out once from the ridge, then silence. Trevor set a slab of cedar across the bench clean, uncut, fragrant with that sharp scent that always made him think of base camp in the early mornings. He didn't say anything as he traced the line with a pencil. He didn't need to. His hands spoke well enough now. He began to carve. Not a replacement for the plaque. Not yet. This was something else. A new piece. A message not for the Vandals, but for the boy. And for the people who sat in silence beside a bench that now felt lonelier than ever. Each motion was deliberate. The chisel moved like a whisper across the grain, curling up shavings that fell, like paper-thin snowflakes to the floor. There was no rage in his work, no fire of vengeance. Just the slow heat of love kept banked through time. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't even about repair. It was about presence. Reclaiming something that had been violated not with force, but with craft. By midday, the sun broke through in brief stretches, and Trevor stepped out onto the porch to test the weight of the piece in his hands. It wasn't finished, but it was real. And when the light hit the wood just right, the carving caught the gold of afternoon sun and held it as if remembering something good. He turned and placed the slab near the fire to dry. The boots sat by the door now, wet around the soles but standing tall. There was no speech to be made, no plan to announce. But in town, people would say later that they felt it. That something shifted that day, quiet as the snow, something that told them he was coming. Not to confront, not to rage, but to work. Because the man with the marine tattoos and the old scar down his leg had not disappeared. He'd just been waiting for the right time to pick up the knife again. The sun hadn't fully crested the ridgeline when Trevor Wallace stepped off the trail and onto the back road that led into town. The frost still clung to the grass, white and delicate like spun glass, and the trees were glazed in silence, holding their breath between winter and spring. His boots left shallow prints in the packed dirt, steady and even, or simply watched him from a porch as he passed through town on the way to the store years ago, when life still moved in shared routines. He wore a worn jacket, waxed canvas, the kind built for mountains and years, and in one hand he carried a flat bundle wrapped in cloth, tied with a thin strip of leather. But it was the cap that people noticed first. It was small, almost too small now, perched above his brow with the brim slightly frayed, and a smudge of dried clay along one side. Navy blue, with a faded red C on the front. Caleb's cap, the one he wore to the 4th of July parade. 3 years in a row, the one he refused to wash because he said the dust made it lucky. It had been tucked away in a drawer for over a year now. It moved through town again, casting a longer shadow than its size would suggest. Trevor didn't say a word as he walked down Main. He didn't have to. The town was just beginning to wake. Lights flickered on in upstairs windows. A truck engine turned over somewhere behind the feed store. Doris Kinney was unlocking the post office when she looked up and saw him. She didn't call out, didn't wave. She simply stepped back from the door and watched as he passed. Her hand rested on the frame, her face unreadable. At Roy's diner, the bell above the door jingled as someone came out with a coffee to go. Nearly bumping into him, the man stopped, stepped aside without a word, and let Trevor continue. Inside, through the frosted windows, people turned in their booths and stared, not rudely, not curiously, but with a quiet that bordered on reverent, like something sacred had entered the morning and they were afraid to speak above it. A boy, on a bike rode toward him on the sidewalk, slowed, then coasted into the gutter and stopped completely. He looked up at Trevor with wide eyes, recognizing the hat. Trevor gave him a single nod. The boy nodded back. That was enough. He didn't change his pace when he reached the park. He stepped off the path where it curved toward the clearing and followed the trail worn down by countless steps that led to the bench. Even from a distance, it looked emptier than it used to. The plaque was still gone. The wood looked raw somehow, as if it had lost something essential in the long absence. Trevor approached it slowly, kneeling beside it as if greeting an old friend after a long silence. He ran one hand along the backrest, then unwrapped the bundle in his hands. The cloth fell away in neat folds, revealing a new panel of cedar. Hand-carved, smoothed, and sealed, with letters cut into it so carefully they seemed to grow from the grain itself. He didn't mount it just yet. He set it on his lap and sat. On the bench for a long while, staring out across the valley Caleb had loved. The cap rested low on his head, casting a shadow over his eyes. He didn't cry, not here. That had already happened, long ago, in the kind of silence that doesn't break easily. Back in town, people said later that the morning felt different. Like something heavy had shifted, like the air knew something it hadn't before. No one spoke to him that day, not because they didn't want to, but because some moments are made not for words, but for watching, and so they watched. The sheriff's office sat on the edge of town, tucked between the grain cope and the old maintenance shed that hadn't been used since the rotary snowplow was retired. The building had once been a single-room fire station, long before the town had the budget for anything more modern. Now it held 2 desks, a coffee machine that groaned louder than the cruiser, and a radio that only came alive when something went wrong. Sheriff David Dorsey arrived before sunrise most days, not because he had to, but because the silence helped him think clearer than the day ever would. That morning, he heard the boots before the door opened. He didn't look up right away, just finished the line he was writing in his ledger and set the pen down beside his coffee mug. The footsteps came in slow, even with a soft drag on the right side, same as it ever was. When Trevor Wallace stepped through the door, the room didn't change. But the temperature of the moment Dorsey didn't rise. He didn't offer a handshake or a chair. He just reached beside his desk and picked up a clear evidence bag. Thick plastic folded over itself, sealed twice with red tape. Inside was a plank oak weathered, a slice of bench seat. The carving was still visible, even though the sheriff had wiped it down gently. He didn't need to speak the words aloud. The cruelty of them still echoed, more graphic in silence than any retelling could allow. He set the bag on the table and tapped it. Once, with the flat of his hand, Trevor stood in the doorway for a long beat, his face unreadable beneath Caleb's old baseball cap. His gaze moved to the bag. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, just stared at it. The way a soldier stares at the dust left behind after something breaks. Dorsey finally spoke. "I didn't think you'd come down." Once, but said nothing. "I figured you'd hear about it. Maybe send Jack. Maybe stay up there and handle it your way." He paused, then added, "Glad you didn't." Still no reply. Dorsey leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. He studied the man standing across from him, the way his shoulders were set, the way he held still without being stiff. Marines had a way of carrying silence like armor. Trevor carried it like it was stitched into his bones. "Do you want to know who did it?" Trevor shook his head, slow and deliberate. "Didn't think so." Dorsey picked up the bag again and turned it slightly so the light from the window caught the carving. "We've got names. We've got statements. A couple of them already owned up, more or less. Parents are. Well, they're doing what parents do when they find out their kids did something they can't explain." Trevor finally stepped into the room, his boots making a soft scrape against the old floor. He didn't sit. He just rested a hand lightly on the edge of the desk and looked at the bag. "I'm not here for them," he said. Dorsey nodded. "I know." Silence settled again, the kind that spoke volumes between men who had once known how to listen to each other without speaking at all. "You gonna replace it?" the sheriff asked. Trevor reached into his coat and pulled out a smaller bundle, wrapped in waxed cloth, tied with a bit of rawhide. He set it down beside the bag, like a quiet offering. "That's for the back of the bench," he said, "not the front." Dorsey raised an eyebrow, but didn't unwrap it. "What's it say?" Trevor's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "Not for me to say, just for those who sit there." The sheriff gave a slow nod. "Town needs this, Trevor. They've been waiting for you, even if they didn't say it out loud." Trevor turned to leave, pausing only at the doorway. "I'm not back," he said. "I'm just not gone." And with that, he stepped into the light and left the evidence bag behind. Principal Alvarez had been through a lot in his years running Dry Fork Middle School. He'd handled lockdown drills, teacher shortages, and more than a few teary parent meetings. But nothing had prepared him for the quiet knock that came just after noon, long after the bells had silenced and the hallways emptied into the soft hum of early dismissal. He looked up to find a man standing in the office doorway, broad-shouldered, weather-worn, a canvas jacket zipped halfway, and a faded red cap perched on his head. There was something familiar about him, something in the eyes. Then Alvarez realized this was Trevor Wallace, Caleb's father, the man from the timberline. Trevor stepped inside slowly, pausing as if waiting for permission that didn't need to be asked. The secretary had already gone home. The building was mostly empty, just the creak of pipes and the click of the wall clock. Alvarez stood, unsure whether to offer his hand or a chair. Trevor saved him the choice by remaining on his feet. "I'm not here to yell," Trevor said plainly. "I didn't think you were," Alvarez replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I heard about the bench." Trevor gave a nod, nothing more. The silence lingered for a moment before Alvarez gestured to the row of chairs in front of his desk. "Would you like to sit?" Trevor shook his head. "No need, I won't." "Be long." Alvarez folded his hands in front of him. "All right, there's students here," Trevor said. "The ones who did it. It wasn't a question." Alvarez hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, 3 of them, 8th graders. We're handling it internally with suspension, counseling, letters to the families." Trevor blinked slowly, but didn't react. "I know that doesn't sound like much," Alvarez added, "but we're treating this seriously. What they did was, it hurt a lot of people." Trevor looked down for the first time, as if studying the grain of the office floor. "I'm not here to ask for punishment," he said, voice low. Alvarez tilted his head. "No, I want them to understand," Trevor replied. "Not what they did to me, or to the bench, but what it meant, what it still means." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small envelope creased slightly. Worn from it, he slid a photograph across the desk. Alvarez took it gently, then turned it over. The picture showed Caleb No, more than 10 years old, grinning with 2 front teeth missing, wearing a firefighter's hat that drooped over one eye. He was sitting on the original slab of wood that would one day become the bench. Legs swinging above the dirt, holding a stick like it was a sword. Behind him, Trevor knelt in the background, his hands resting on the boy's shoulders. Alvarez swallowed. "He looks happy," he was. Trevor said, "That was the day we started building it. Just the 2 of us. He didn't know what it would be for, neither did I, but we were building something, and he was proud of it." Alvarez looked up, uncertain what to say. "I want you to show that to the boys," Trevor continued. "Let them see his face. Let them see what they carved into." "I can do that," Alvarez said quietly. "I'm not looking for an apology," Trevor added. "Just a moment. One honest moment where they realize what a name can carry." Alvarez nodded again. "I'll make sure they see it." Trevor stepped back toward the door. Before he left, he turned and said one last thing so soft it might been for the room more than the man. "I don't want them afraid of me. I want them to remember him." Then he walked out, leaving only the photograph and the scent of snow still clinging to his coat. Tyler hadn't thought about the bench since the day they scratched it. It was just something dumb they did him, Gavin and Milo after. A long afternoon of doing nothing and trying to look like they didn't care about anything they'd passed. by that old bench at the edge of the ridge 100 times, and it always sat there like a dare. Gavin kicked his feet up first, Milo tossed a rock, and Tyler, trying to be the loudest, the boldest, had pulled out his knife and scraped into the wood without thinking twice. "Better off dead," he'd said, laughing at his own cleverness. He didn't even know why those words came to him, just sounded like something that would sting. Sounded cool, but now, weeks later, he couldn't sleep right. He dreamed in fragments, a boy sitting on the edge of the trail, swinging his legs and humming to himself, a red cap falling off into the dirt. Sometimes the boy looked up at him in the dream, sometimes not. But when he did, his eyes weren't angry. They were confused. Sad, maybe? Like he was waiting for someone to explain something. Tyler didn't know who the kid was, not at first, but the dreams kept coming. Not every night, but enough that he started leaving his window cracked for the air and sleeping without his earbuds. One morning, he woke up with tears on his face. No memory of the dream, just the image of that bench, the empty space where the plaque used to be, the carved words. He stopped hanging out with Gavin after school. Milo texted him a meme, and he didn't reply. Something about being around them now made his stomach hurt. At school, it wasn't like anyone knew. The teachers hadn't said his name. No one gave him a dirty look. But Principal Alvarez called him into his office one afternoon without warning. Tyler sat stiff in the chair, fingers twitching in his lap. Alvarez didn't scold, didn't even look angry. He just pulled something from a drawer and slid it across. The desk data photo. A kid younger than Tyler, maybe 10 or 11, sitting on a log, smiling like the world hadn't touched him yet. A red cap falling over one eye. "That's Caleb," the principal said. "The bench you marked was built for him." Tyler didn't speak. He died 2 years ago, hit by a car. On the lower trail, he used to wave at everyone who passed, said it made them feel seen. Tyler felt something tightened in his chest. "I'm not asking you to say anything," Alvarez added. "Just look." So Tyler did. He stared at that picture longer than he expected. Later that week, he walked alone to the edge of Walker's Ridge. He hadn't told anyone, just said he was staying late for tutoring and slipped out after 5th period. The sky was gray, the air sharp, and the trail quieter than he remembered. When he reached the bench, he stood a few feet away and looked at it without moving closer. The carving was gone now. The plaque wasn't back yet, but there was something else, a folded square of cloth placed gently on the seat. He didn't touch it, just stared. He sat, finally, just for a moment, long enough to feel the cold seep through his jeans, long enough to imagine that little kid sitting there beside him, not speaking, just looking out over the trees. When he left, he didn't say anything to the others, didn't explain why he avoided their calls or skipped their messages. But that night, when the dream came again, Caleb didn't look sad. He just sat there, cap crooked, legs swinging, waiting. The sky stayed the same color, all de gray, thick and unmoving, like the world was holding something in. Not a drop of rain fell, but the air carried weight, as if a storm hovered just above the trees, unwilling to land. People in town noticed. They stepped outside with umbrellas they never opened, checked the sky more often, turned off radios just to sit in the hush. It wasn't wind they felt, it was something else. Down at Walker's Ridge, the old pines still stood sentry beside the clearing. The bench sat beneath it, stripped down and waiting. The wood had been sanded, the gouges removed, but the seat wasn't sealed yet. It looked raw, again new, and old at the same time. Trevor arrived before most folks were awake. No announcement, no company, just him and the tools he'd carried down the mountain in a weathered canvas roll tied with rope. He moved slowly, not from hesitation, but from precision. Each movement was deliberate, his hands sure even after all these years. He didn't wear gloves. He needed to feel the wood to press it into place with bare fingers. He laid out the new slat for the backrest first, holding it up to the frame and checking the fit. Then he unscrewed the temporary plank that had held its place since the damage, setting it aside like something sacred. The new piece was a darker cedar sealed with something faintly glossy. But it wasn't the color that drew attention, it was what was carved into it. There were no names, no dates, just 5 words, hand-carved, each letter cut carefully and deep. Sit here. Remember him kindly. He mounted it to the bench without pause. The sound of the screwdriver echoed through the clearing, sharp and rhythmic, like a bell in the still air. He didn't hurry. He wiped the screws clean before tightening them, checked the level twice, then stepped back. The bench looked whole again, not restored to what it had been but remade. Word spread fast. Someone walking their dog saw him and texted a cousin. That cousin mentioned it at the diner. Before noon, people were quietly making their way to the trail, not in groups, not as a spectacle, but like they'd been pulled by something they couldn't name. No one spoke to Trevor when they arrived. They stayed at a distance, watching from behind tree trunks and trail bends. They didn't need to interrupt. What they were witnessing wasn't for show. It felt more like watching someone pray. Back in town, Tyler sat on the edge of his bed, phone buzzing with updates from Gavin and Milo, both pretending nothing had happened. He didn't answer. He just stared at the photograph the principal had given him, still folded in his jacket pocket. That picture didn't leave his mind now. Neither did the way the bench had looked when he last saw it. He wasn't the only one. Gavin stopped riding his bike near the park. Milo skipped school that day, claimed a stomachache, but really just couldn't bear the chance of seeing Trevor Wallace. The man hadn't raised his voice, hadn't threatened a thing, but his presence hung over the town like the clouds, quiet, heavy, undeniable. People said the bench looked stronger now, firmer, not because the wood had changed, but because the hands that rebuilt it had, and they hadn't rebuilt it for revenge. They'd rebuilt it for memory. The plaque wasn't back yet, but no one asked about it. The new carving was enough. By dusk, Trevor was gone. No one saw him leave. Just as quietly as he came, he returned. To the timberline, the tools were gone. The canvas rolled to only the bench remained, dry despite the thick air, sturdy despite what it had endured. That night, the wind picked up, just slightly, enough to stir leaves along the ground and make the pines whisper, and in houses across Dry Fork. People slept with their windows open not for the breeze, but for the stillness. The morning after the bench was rebuilt, the fog didn't lift until well past 9. It rolled in low and thick, blanketing the park trail like breath against glass. Most people stayed indoors that morning, sipping coffee by their windows, their eyes drifting to the woods without knowing exactly why. There was no official word, no note in the paper or whisper in the church bulletin. But wordless things had a way of spreading in Dry Fork, and today, people felt something shift again. By noon, the fog gave way to a thin, milky light, and a few walkers made their way to the ridge. Some came alone, a mother with a stroller, an older man with a dog. None said much to the others. They simply paused when they reached the bench. It looked the same at first, the same new cedar plank across the backrest, the same soft gloss along the grain. But then someone noticed it. On the underside, carved not on the seat or the face of the backrest, but on the hidden part, just along the beam where only someone sitting would ever see. The words weren't deep. They had been etched with care, small enough to go unnoticed, unless you were looking. If you miss someone, sit. For simple words, but they landed harder than any speech could have. Later, someone said it was like being tapped on the shoulder by a ghost, gentle but undeniable. It didn't feel like a command. It felt like permission. Tyler found out about the carving from an Instagram post. Someone had taken a picture of the words and posted it with the caption, "This town remembers." He stared at the image for a long time, then set his phone down and went to his closet. He pulled on a hoodie and walked out without saying a word to his mom. He took the trail slower this time, not out of guilt, exactly. It was something else. Respect, maybe? Or the need to move through the air differently, like the very path had changed. When he reached the bench, no one else was there. He sat. It was the first time he really sat. Not like before, when he'd sprawled across it laughing, tossing gum wrappers and calling Caleb a name he hadn't even earned. This time, he sat properly, shoulders forward, feet planted. He ran his hand along the wood beneath the backrest until his fingers found the carving. His throat tightened, not with tears, but with understanding. He sat there longer than he meant to, listening to the breeze move through the pine needles. At one point, a pair of hikers passed by and gave him a quiet nod. He nodded back, but didn't speak. Tyler didn't know Trevor Wallace well. He'd only seen him once, across the school parking lot, but he knew now that the man hadn't come down the mountain to scare anyone. He came to leave something behind, something more lasting than a name or a warning. Elsewhere, in town, others came to. The bench became a place of pause. Not pilgrimage, not spectacle. Just a small corner of the world where people allowed themselves to stop pretending. Where they let silence sit beside them and didn't chase it away. The mayor came early one morning and left a folded flag on the seat for 5 quiet minutes before taking it back again. A teenage girl who'd never met Caleb brought a matchbox car and set it gently on the wood, then walked away without looking back. And still, the carving remained not bold, not front-facing, not meant to be read from the trail, for those who needed it. If you miss someone, sit. It wasn't about Caleb anymore. Or rather, it wasn't just about Caleb. The bench had become something else. A place where grief was allowed to exhale. Where people could remember without explanation. And in a town that rarely said too much, that was more than enough. It was Martha who found it first. Not that she'd been looking. The old groundskeeper still made her rounds every week, dragging her left foot a little slower now, her cane thumping against the packed trail with each step. She didn't speak. Anymore, not since the stroke, but her eyes missed nothing. She'd been the quiet steward of the park for decades, tending to flower beds, replacing rotted planks on picnic tables, sweeping pine needles from places no one ever noticed. She had known Caleb, watched him grow up, watched him wave to strangers with a grin too wide for his face, watched him vanish from the trail one afternoon and never come back. She stopped by the bench like she always did, ran a gloved hand along. The wood checked the bolts, wiped away a spiderweb that had formed in the crook of the armrest. She paused as she lowered her hand and felt something brush her knuckles-an edge, something underneath. Crouching slowly, she reached beneath the bench seat and felt around with her fingertips. There, tucked against the support beam, was a small metal box. Not rusty, not new, bolted shut, but designed to open with a twist latch on the side. There were words etched onto the top dot for strangers, for friends, for the ones who forget and the ones who try to remember. Martha sat down on the bench with a slow exhale and opened the latch. The lid creaked slightly. Inside was a stack of folded pages, neatly tied together with a blue ribbon. The first sheet was labeled in crooked pencil, letters by Caleb Wallace, 3rd to 6th grade. She didn't read them right away, just held them in her lap for a long moment, staring at the loop of the handwriting on the cover page. It was unmistakably a child's hand loose round, hopeful. Later that day, Martha brought the pages to Principal Alvarez, slipping them into his hands without a word. She watched him read the first one and saw how he sat back slowly, lips pressed together, blinking longer than usual. The letters weren't essays, they weren't journals either. They were conversations. Each one began the same way. Dear whoever finds this someday. Then Caleb would go on about anything. A frog he'd seen that morning, a joke he'd made up in the lunch line, a question he wanted to ask the stars but didn't know how. In one letter, he wrote about a girl who cried at recess and how he gave her his cookie. In another, he described the smell of the cedar slab his dad was sanding and how it reminded him of church. There were over 20 letters in the bundle, all different lengths, some only a paragraph, some pages long. Word spread dot by the weekend. The school had created copies and laminated the originals. A weatherproof frame was built beside the bench, with a note encouraging people to take one letter at a time and leave it when they were done. People did. They came in the early mornings and late afternoons, picking a letter at random and reading it with their heads bowed. Some cried. Others laughed at the way Caleb misspelled cinnamon, or the way he described clouds as giant ghost pancakes. Tyler came, too. He didn't take a letter at first, just stood beside the frame reading the titles with his hands in his pockets. Then one day, he slid out the shortest one, folded it neatly, and sat on the bench to read. That letter simply said, Dear whoever, I hope you feel seen today. Sometimes people forget to see you. I used to wave at everybody. I think it helped. And for the first time in weeks, Tyler smiled. Not out of relief, not out of guilt, but because he finally understood what the bench had become. It wasn't a shrine, it was a voice. And Caleb, somehow, was still waving. Mrs. Paxton had taught at Dry Fork Elementary for over 25 years. The framed class photos lined the wall behind her desk like a timeline of growing faces and changing haircuts. She'd kept all the cards and drawings her students had, made over the years, tucked into folders by grade and year. Most were stick figures and lopsided hearts, the kind of childish art that faded with time. But one folder remained in the front of her drawer. It was labeled Caleb Wallace, 4th grade. She hadn't looked at it in a long while. Not because she'd forgotten him, quite the opposite. Caleb had been one of those children who left a trace. He wasn't the loudest, not the fastest, or the most gifted, but he had a way of sitting in silence that didn't feel empty, like he was listening to something the rest of them hadn't quite tuned into yet. She remembered clearly the day he came to her desk after class, while the rest of the students filed out for lunch. He stood there quietly, the way he always did. When he wanted to ask something big, he clutched his notebook to his chest and shifted from foot to foot. "Mrs. Paxton," he'd said, eyes wide and unsure, "is being brave the same as going to war?" It was the kind of question you had to step into carefully, especially in a town like Dry Fork, especially when a boy's father wore combat boots to every parent-teacher night and still had sand-colored scars on his knuckles. She took a breath and answered him the only way she knew how. "No, Caleb," she said softly. "Bravery comes in many forms. Going to war is one kind of bravery. But so is telling the truth. So is being kind when it's hard. So is being the first to say sorry." Caleb had nodded thoughtfully, but didn't say anything more. He just sat with the words. A week later, he turned in a writing assignment that she kept to this day. The prompt had been simple: "What is something you believe?" Most of the children had written about dinosaurs or fairies or God, but Caleb's answer was different. He wrote, "I believe people can be brave in small ways. Like when you sit with someone who's sad, or you wave at a person you don't know just so they feel less invisible." Mrs. Paxton had given him a gold star, but even now, she wished she'd done more. When the letters were found beneath the bench, she wasn't surprised. She'd seen Caleb's voice take shape before anyone else had. She recognized the rhythm of his thoughts, the way his sentences curled, not just to inform, but to comfort. She visited the bench in the early morning, before the first bell rang. She left a copy of his essay laminated in plastic beneath the wooden box, and then she sat. It was still and cold. The kind of morning where breath hangs in the air and birds haven't yet dared to sing. She looked out across the ridge, the same direction Caleb used to point when he said clouds looked like dragons. Her hands were folded on her lap. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just remembered later that day, she pulled the folder out from her drawer at school and opened it. Inside were more of his writings, a watercolor painting of frogs in a pond, and a list he'd made titled, "Things I Want to Do Before I'm 20. At the top, it read, "Build something with my dad. Teach someone to whistle. Make a stranger feel happy for no reason." She read the list 3 times. That evening, after parent-teacher conferences, she stopped by the bench again. A boy she didn't know was sitting there reading one of the letters. Mrs. Paxton didn't interrupt. She just placed a small rock on the corner of the wooden box to keep it steady in the wind, and whispered more to the breeze than anyone else. "You are right, Caleb. Bravery does come in many forms." Then she walked back down the trail, her steps quiet, her heart full, carrying nothing with her but the knowledge that some truths outlive even the smallest hands that first dared to write them. It started with a trowel, just a simple one, the kind you find in any shed, its handle worn smooth and its blade dulled by years of garden beds and rocky soil. It was left leaning against the base of the bench one morning, tucked beside a small paper bag of marigold starters. No note, no explanation, just the quiet suggestion of intention. By midday, someone had planted them. The marigolds were clustered in a neat row under the curve of the bench, where their orange-yellow blossoms caught the light even on overcast days. The next day, a row of white alyssum joined them. The day after that, lavender. No one claimed credit. No one needed to. It was a town of porch lights left on for neighbors and meals delivered without fanfare. But something had shifted since the letters were found, and the new carving was made. It was like a bell had been struck at the center of the town, and now the reverberation was traveling outward. A week after the marigolds appeared, someone repainted the park fence. The chipping white slats that bordered the east trail had long been ignored, more gray than white, with splinters and rusted nails. But on a Tuesday afternoon, a fresh coat of paint began to bloom across the boards. The brushstrokes were uneven at first, clearly the work of more than one hand. But by the weekend, the fence gleamed again, even under clouded skies. In the post office, a new corkboard was added beside the usual notices about lost pets and community bake sales. This one was different. Its handwritten title read, "Things Caleb Taught Me." The first card, thumbtacked dead center, read, "Wave at strangers. They might need it." Others followed. Being quiet doesn't mean you're not listening. Kindness doesn't need a reason. Frogs are cooler than they get credit for. The grocery store manager, without saying anything, began offering a discount to kids who donated to the local food pantry. A coffee shop downtown added a pay-it-forward jar, and the town's carpenter repaired the roof of the old bus stop without charging the county a dime. No speeches were made, no meetings were held, but it was happening. Caleb's bench had become more than a memory. It had become a catalyst. Even the teens who had been involved, the ones who once kicked their feet up on the bench and marked it with cruel words, found themselves drawn into something they hadn't expected. Tyler began helping the grounds crew after school, quietly, without needing acknowledgement. Milo showed up on a Saturday morning with his dad and helped patch holes in the trail's side rails. Gavin, though he didn't say much, was seen sitting alone by the flower bed, a sketchbook open in his lap. None of them were punished by law, but the town had a way of holding people accountable that didn't require handcuffs. It required Grace Ann. Remembering, even the mountains seemed to respond. Snow came later that year. The cold softened. The trail stayed passable well into November, and hikers reported hearing wind chimes in the trees, though none had been installed. An elderly couple arrived from out of town. They didn't say why they came or how they heard about the bench. They just sat quietly for a while. Then the woman left a small tin of lemon cookies and a note that simply read, "For anyone who needs sweetness today." The cookies were gone. By dusk, the note remained. No one ever called it a memorial, not out loud. That word felt too final. What the bench had become was something else entirely. It was a place where things started, again, not just memories, but motion. A ripple of goodness that reached outward, changing the town not through grandeur, but through gestures so small they might have been missed if you weren't paying attention. Dry Fork was paying attention now, and the bench, in its stillness, kept whispering what words never could. The day Trevor Wallace left town again, no one saw him go. There was no announcement, no wave from the edge of the trail, no note pinned to a bulletin board. The only sign that he had returned to the mountains was absence quiet, complete and unmistakable. But those who passed the bench that week knew. They noticed the subtle signs, the ones that didn't require words. The boots were the first thing they sat neatly beneath the bench, not tossed or forgotten, but placed deliberately, laces tucked, soles still damp with trail mud, dried pine, needles clinging to the rubber edges, the kind of boots that told a story just by their scuffs. They had walked farther than most people ever would, through sand, through snow, through memory. A carving knife had been left as well, its wooden handle polished smooth from years of use. It rested on the bench itself, blade nestled in a piece of folded cloth. No rust, no chips, just sharp and clean. A tool passed down. Discarded, some people stopped to stare at the items. Others left them undisturbed, sensing they weren't meant to be claimed. A few recognized the boots right away, had seen them once clomping through the town store, trailing slush onto the linoleum, or planted firmly beneath Trevor's legs as he stood silent at the back of the school assembly. The year Caleb would have graduated elementary, but he hadn't stayed long then either. It was just his way. He came when the town needed something steadied, not rescued, just reminded. The bench, now finished in every way it could be, held no more secrets. The flowers continued to bloom at its base, now joined by a small patch of creeping thyme someone had planted, its smell rising gently when the wind moved right. The frame with Caleb's letters remained carefully tended. And each month, new children wrote their own notes and tucked them into the waterproof box beneath, answering Caleb with their own stories. One boy, age 7, had scribbled a reply that simply said, "I wave now, too," even when no one waves back. The sheriff walked the ridge trail that evening and paused by the boots. He didn't touch them, just stood there for a while, hat in his hands, remembering things no one else could carry. Then he turned and made his way back down before the sun dipped too low. At the library. The kids section had a new shelf labeled books Caleb would have liked. A local artist had painted a small mural above it, frogs, fire trucks, and a boy waving from behind a tree. And far above it all, the mountain stayed as it always had, silent, massive, unknowable. Those who hiked its upper trails said they sometimes saw a wisp of smoke curling from a cabin chimney near the timberline. Never thick, never long, just enough to say someone was home, if only for a while. Tyler made the climb once. He didn't make it all the way, not to the cabin, not even close. But he made it high enough to see the shape of the valley below, the winding trail that led back to the bench, and how small it looked from up there. He sat on a rock, catching his breath, and took the photo of Caleb out from his jacket pocket, the one he'd kept folded for weeks now. He didn't cry, he just nodded once, tucked the photo back into place, and started down again. The carving knife stayed on the bench for a month before someone built a glass case to keep it safe. They didn't mount it on a wall or turn it into a monument. They just placed it there with a simple brass tag that read, "Used to mend what others tried to break." And the boots stayed too, beneath the bench, their soles slowly drying, their purpose already fulfilled. Trevor Wallace had returned to the mountain knot to hide, not to disappear, but because his work in town was done. He had given them the tools, the words, and the silence, and now the town knew how to carry them. The rain came without warning, a soft drizzle at first, just enough to darken the dirt path and dapple the benches with cold. The sky had been moody all morning, clouds gathering without drama, only that heavy stillness that often preceded weather in the mountains. By early afternoon, it was a steady fall, not violent, just persistent. The kind of rain that soaks quietly, one drop at a time. Tyler didn't plan to go. None of them had. But sometimes things pull you without asking. He met Gavin and Milo at the corner of Ridge and Main, all three of them wearing hoodies with the hoods pulled up, hands stuffed in their pockets like they had something to be ashamed of but weren't ready to name it. No one said where they were going. They didn't have to. The trail was slick and smelled of wet bark and moss. Their sneakers slipped a little on the muddy slope, and they didn't talk as they walked. Each step felt like it echoed louder than it should have, the silence between them louder still. When they reached the bench, it was empty. Of course it was. No one came to sit in the rain except them. Tyler sat first, pulling his hood down, letting the water run down his face. Milo followed, shoulders tense. Gavin hesitated the longest, standing off to the side, like he was waiting for some sign that it was okay. Then, finally, he sat too. They didn't speak. The rain ran in little rivulets down the backrest of the bench, beating on the carved cedar letters. "Sit here, remember him kindly." None of them had said his name in weeks, not to each other, not to anyone. Caleb had become a ghost between them, visible only in glances. In avoided conversations, in the way their laughter had changed, Tyler reached down and touched the edge of the wooden box beneath the bench. He didn't open it, just rested his fingers there, grounding himself like the bench had weight he needed to hold on to. After a while, Milo whispered, "I keep seeing his face." No one asked what he meant. No one needed to. Tyler nodded. His voice came out rough, like it hadn't been used in days. "I dream about him waving. Like, just waving. That's it. He doesn't say anything. He's not mad." Mad's head dropped forward, and his shoulders started to shake. It was quiet at first, just a tremble. But then it overtook him, and the sob burst out without warning. He turned his face toward his knees and let the tears fall, mixing with the rain until there was no telling which was which. None of them tried to stop him. None of them told him to be quiet, or said it was okay. They just sat, three teenage boys, on a bench built for remembering, rain soaking their jeans, their hoods heavy with water, their silence louder than the storm. Eventually, Gavin's sobs slowed. Milo passed him a crumpled napkin from his pocket. Tyler wiped at his face with his sleeve, though he wasn't sure if he'd cried or not. It didn't matter. They didn't apologize. They didn't have to. After some time, Milo leaned back and looked up at the sky, rain splashing into his eyes. "You think he'd still wave at us?" he asked, voice barely above the sound of the rain. In the trees, Tyler didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "Yeah, I think that's just who he was." They sat for another few minutes, unmoving, water dripping from their elbows, the soles of their shoes caked with red trail mud, and for the first time, the bench didn't feel like a punishment or a place of guilt. It felt like permission. permission. To be still, permission to remember. Permission to feel what they hadn't let themselves feel when it happened. When they finally stood, they didn't look at each other, but Gavin reached down and placed his hand on the backrest. Not a carving, not a mark dot, just a hand. And then he walked away. The rain continued, unbothered, and the bench remained. Quiet, solid, waiting. The community center wasn't much to look at from the outside cement steps, with a cracked corner. An American flag that had faded to a soft pink from too many seasons under the mountain sun. And windows that rattled when the wind got loud. But the inside was clean, warm, and familiar. Folding chairs were arranged in a loose horseshoe, and a coffee pot burbled softly in the corner. The sign outside said Veterans Council Monthly Meeting, but tonight the air held something quieter. Anticipation, maybe, or respect. Trevor Wallace arrived just after 6. He didn't wear his uniform. He never did. He came in a dark flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, a pair of jeans stained at the knees from woodwork, and boots scuffed to near ruin. He nodded to a few familiar faces, men he'd served beside, others who had served before him. There were no salutes, just quiet recognition. At the front of the room stood a podium no one had used in months. Sheriff Dorsey was off to the side, leaning with his arms folded, saying little. Behind the podium, a small table was set up with a framed certificate and a velvet box. The metal inside was polished, brass glinting even under the old ceiling. Lights on it had been voted on unanimously. The council had drafted the recognition for what they called acts of quiet courage and community healing in the face of desecration and loss. It wasn't military issued, but it carried weight, because it came from them, from men who understood grief, restraint, and the value of rebuilding when anger would have been easier. Trevor walked to the front slowly, one leg stiff with every step, the limp noticeable but unremarked. When he reached the table, he looked at the medal for a long moment. Then he closed the box gently and slid it back toward the council chair. "I appreciate the gesture," he said, voice low even, "but I didn't come here for medals. No." One moved. No one objected. They knew he hadn't come to be honored. He stepped behind the podium, resting his hands on either side. His fingers curled slightly over the edges, steady, calloused, unshaking. "I was a sergeant. I gave orders, and I followed some. I've seen men break, and I've seen boys stand taller than generals. But nothing in that life prepared me to bury my son." The room was still. He paused, not for effect, but to breathe, to choose his next words. "When Caleb died, part of me did too. That's not poetry. That's just what happens. You go up into the mountains, away from the noise, away from people who ask too gently and mean too well. You cut wood, you stop talking, and you wait." He looked up then, eyes sweeping the room slowly. "But then I heard what happened to his bench, the one I built so I'd have a reason to go back down that mountain. And I didn't come down to punish. I didn't come down to scare anybody. I came down because I owed it to my son to remind people how to act right when no one's looking." There was a soft shifting in the seats. A hand moved to adjust a cap, a boot scraped lightly on the floor. Trevor continued, "I left behind a knife and a pair of boots, not because I'm done, but because sometimes the tools you leave behind speak louder than the ones you carry. That bench wasn't about memory. It was about what you do with memory." He nodded once, then stepped away from the podium. Stayed quiet. Then, from the back, an older man-gray beard, Vietnam patch on his vest rose to his feet. "I served in '68, he said. "I never knew your boy. But I sat at that bench last week, and I heard a kid read one of his letters. Out loud. That's the kind of healing none of us could have ordered. You gave it to us anyway." Trevor didn't reply. He simply gave a slow nod and returned to his seat. The medal stayed in its box on the table. By the time the meeting ended, no one mentioned it again. It would stay there, in the display case by the entrance. No nameplate, no glass cover, just a medal resting beside a folded piece of paper with 4 words in a child's handwriting. "If you miss someone, sit." And every veteran in that room understood. He didn't speak often, not in town, not on trails, not even with those who once shared his rations and watched his back under desert skies. Trevor Wallace had always been a man of quiet presence, the kind who didn't need to explain himself, the kind who let long silences fill a room and still somehow communicate exactly what needed saying. Most people thought it was the war that made him that way, but they were wrong. It wasn't the war. It was Caleb. It took months before he said more than a few words at a time. He came and went through town like a shadow nodding at shopkeepers, placing quiet orders at the hardware store, brushing past neighbors with a gaze that was never unfriendly, just ... distant. A distance that said, "I'm here, but not all the way." Then one morning in late spring, something changed. It wasn't an event. There was no anniversary, no public gathering, just a chair pulled out at a small community breakfast held at the firehouse, a place with creaky floors, donated muffins, and mismatched coffee mugs. Trevor took a seat beside. The fire chief nodded at a few familiar faces and ate his scrambled eggs in silence. Across the table was Anna Lutz, the school counselor, whose own son had been in Caleb's class. She hadn't spoken to Trevor much since the funeral, not because she didn't want to, just because she never knew if it would help. That morning, she finally said softly, "I think about him a lot." Trevor looked up, his fork hovering just above his plate. He didn't reply right away, but after a moment, he set the fork down and leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "I used to think silence kept me strong," he said. "Not loud, but clear. In the corps, they teach you not to let the pain show. You take it, you file it, you move on." Anna listened, her coffee growing cold in her hands. He went on slowly, almost like he was rediscovering his own voice as he spoke. "But losing Caleb, there's no protocol for that, no map, no chain of command, just empty rooms and unfinished sentences. I kept thinking that if I said his name out loud, it'd break something in me I couldn't fix." The table was quiet now. Even those who weren't part of the conversation had tuned in. Drawn not by volume, but by the gravity of what was finally being said, Trevor glanced down at the scar on his knuckle, one of many, and traced it absent-mindedly with his thumb. "Built that bench because I didn't know what else to do. It was the only thing I could shape with my hands when everything else was falling apart. But even then, I didn't sit on it. Not once. Not until after it was damaged." Anna set her mug down gently. "Why then?" He looked at her, his gaze steady but soft. "Because grief demands witness, and silence isn't always strength. Sometimes it's just armor, heavy, hot, and built for survival. But not for healing." He paused again, then added, "I think I wore mine too long. No one tried to fill the space that followed. No jokes, no reassurances. Just the simple respect of listening." He finished his eggs without saying much else. But when he stood to leave, he placed a small, folded piece of paper on the table in front of Anna. She waited until he'd walked out the door before opening it. It was a note. Written in Trevor's slow, deliberate handwriting, it read, "I'm still learning how to speak his name without breaking, but I'm getting closer." And that was enough. In the weeks that followed, he said a little more. At council meetings, in brief talks with the sheriff, in quiet moments when someone asked about Caleb, not with pity, but with genuine remembrance, he didn't tell war stories. He never listed medals or deployments. But when he spoke now, it was always with intention, and more often than not, it was about a boy who liked frogs and waved at strangers. A boy whose laughter could split through the silence like light through a boarded window, and through those words, few as they were. Trevor Wallace slowly laid down his armor, one sentence at a time. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked between a stack of utility bills and a flyer advertising discounted roofing. The envelope was plain, no return address, no stamp, just a soft, off-white rectangle sealed at the flap and slipped into the mailbox like it belonged there. Trevor almost tossed it aside with the rest of the unread mail, the kind of mail that didn't matter anymore, not in the way it used to, but something about it, maybe the careful way it had been folded, or the fact that it was the only one, without a printed barcode, made him pause. He took it inside, sat at the kitchen table where the wood had worn smooth from years of elbows and coffee mugs, and opened it without ceremony. There was no note, just a photograph. He stared at it for a long time, not blinking, barely breathing. The image was slightly grainy, as if taken on an old phone, but it was clear enough. It showed the bench, Caleb's bench. Only now, it looked different. Not in structure, not in shape, but in the people around it. 3 teenage boys stood in the frame, not posed, not smiling. They didn't know they were being photographed. Their heads were down, focused on the task, One was holding a paintbrush, the bristles dipped in soft brown stain. Another was kneeling, rubbing at the legs of the bench with a rag. The third had a hand on the plaque, steadying it while the others worked. Their faces were familiar. Trevor didn't need names. He recognized the angles of their shoulders, the way they carried themselves with that specific tension of guilt wrapped in silence. These were the boys, the ones who had laughed, who had desecrated, who had turned his son's memorial into something cruel. And now here they were, not punished, not posing, just fixing. He sat with the photo for a long time. He didn't cry, that wasn't his way. But his fingers pressed against the edges of the paper, tracing the shapes like he was memorizing the moment. Like he didn't want to forget the way the light fell on the bench, or how the trees in the background blurred into early spring green Dot who had taken the photo. He thought briefly of Martha, the old groundskeeper. She had eyes everywhere, even if her voice had been taken. Or maybe it was Sheriff Dorsey, quietly watching from the trail, saying nothing but knowing everything. It didn't matter. What mattered was that someone had seen and that someone had chosen to share it with him. The photograph still in his hand, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel something other than ache. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was close. A gentler emotion, softer around the edges, like breathing. In warm air, after months of cold, outside, the wind rattled the pine branches, and a bird tapped at the window before fluttering off. The mailbox still sat open from when he retrieved the envelope, a flap raised like a flag waving goodbye to an old season. Trevor stood and walked to the mantel. He pulled down the old tin box where he kept the few keepsakes that mattered. Inside were Caleb's drawings, a picture of him in a frog costume from 2nd grade, and a strip of wood carved with the words for Caleb, "You are still loved." He added the photograph carefully, laying it flat against the others. He closed the box, not to hide it, but to hold it. Later that day, he walked into town not to confront, not to inspect, but to simply be past the post office, the hardware store, and paused at the edge of the park. He didn't walk all the way to the bench, not this time. He just stood at the top of the hill and looked down. The stain was still fresh, and the boys he'd heard had come back more than once. Not because anyone asked them to, but because something inside them told them it mattered. That bench had become more than a tribute. It had become a mirror. And what Trevor saw now, in that single photograph left in his mailbox, was that even the worst moments could give way to grace quietly, without ceremony, in a gesture as small as a boy repainting a bench he once tried to ruin. It was the kind of morning that didn't draw much attention to itself. A pale sky, air still and cool. The usual hush of early light settling over Walker's Ridge Park, interrupted only by the occasional creak of trees adjusting their weight. In the windless air, the trail to the bench had begun to grow familiar again. Boots, shoes, even wheelchairs had found their way back to it. But today, something was different. The bench looked the same from a distance, same shape, same wood grain, catching the slant of the sun. But as people approached, they began to pause, heads tilted, brows furrowed. Some leaned in closer, others stood still. The words had changed. The original carving had been replaced. Not erased. Trevor would never have done that. But reworked, expanded. The top line was still there, as it had always been, for Caleb. But beneath it, now carved with the same care and steadiness, was something new. And for all the ones we couldn't keep. It didn't shout, it didn't beg attention. It simply existed, like it had always been meant to be there. News traveled quickly in a town like Dry Fork. By noon, most people who'd known Caleb simply cared about what the bench had come to represent, had heard about the change. Some walked the trail again, just to see it with their own eyes. Mrs. Paxton came first, her shoes damp from the dew and her cardigan pulled tight. She touched the backrest gently, tracing the letters with the edge of her palm. Then came Dorsey, the sheriff, quiet and deliberate. He stood beside the bench with his hands in his pockets, saying nothing, but nodding once before turning back up the trail. Children passed by later, on their way to the creek or the climbing logs. A few read the new words out loud, squinting. At the carved lines, most didn't understand what it meant. Not fully, but they could feel something in it, something soft and important. Later that afternoon, Anna Lutz brought a small bundle of photos. Old class pictures, kids Caleb had grown up with. Kids who weren't here anymore. Accidents, illnesses, a car that never braked in time. She tucked the photos into the weatherproof box beneath the bench, alongside Caleb's letters and the notes, written by strangers. A quiet offering. No one had seen Trevor come down from the mountain that week. But those who'd looked closely at the new carving knew whose hand had made it. The knife was still his. The lettering was deep and even, with the unmistakable pressure of someone who carved not just with their hand, but with memory. He hadn't asked for permission. He hadn't warned anyone, but he had known it was time. The bench had never been. Just for Caleb, that had become clear over the months. It had become a gathering point for grief in all its forms, silent, messy, unresolved, a place where parents sat and let the weight of absence pass through them. Where teens came to ask questions they didn't yet know how to answer. Where veterans stood in the rain and said nothing at all. The new line on the plaque made room for all of that, for all the ones we couldn't keep. It was a sentence wide enough to hold a dozen names, 100, 1,000 names, never spoken out loud, stories never told. It offered no explanation, no justification, only acknowledgement. Some people we keep, some we don't. The reasons vary. The ache does not. Tyler saw it on his way home from school. He stopped mid-step when he noticed it. His stomach tightened. He hadn't known there would be a change. He hadn't expected to feel what he did. He stood there a long while, alone, until the clouds began to roll in from the west. He didn't touch the bench, didn't sit down, but before he left, he whispered something under his breath. Just one name, not Caleb's, someone else's, a friend he hadn't spoken of since middle school. And in that quiet, the new plaque held the name like it belonged to it, and it did. As the light dimmed and the shadows stretched long across the park, the bench stood, still and moving, unchanged in form. But something in its presence had shifted again. It was no longer just a monument, no longer just a tribute. It had become something broader, an invitation to remember, to speak, to grieve without shame, and to carve, if not in wood, then in the small, unseen gestures that say, I haven't forgotten, and I won't. It started with a photo. Not the first one. The photo that had appeared in Trevor's mailbox never made it past town, but a different one. She'd been on a solo hike through the Ridge Trail, her boots still fresh from city sidewalks, looking for silence and finding something deeper. She came across the bench just after dawn, with the trees casting long shadows and a soft mist still clinging to the grass. She took a picture without thinking, drawn to the carving more than the view, for Caleb and for all the ones we couldn't keep. She didn't know who Caleb was. She didn't know the town's story, but something about those words stayed with her. And when she posted the photo online with a caption that simply read, I found this on a trail in a quiet town. I don't know who carved it, but it broke me open. People noticed. The post spread slowly at first, a few hundred shares, then a few thousand. Comments poured in, stories from strangers, names whispered into the comment section like prayers. Parents spoke of lost sons, daughters, siblings, friends. Veterans left messages for brothers in arms who never came home. Teachers mentioned students they still remembered, empty seats that never got filled. No hashtags, no campaigns, just a photo and a feeling. A month later, in a town 3 states over, a new bench appeared near a local playground. This one was simple pine instead of cedar, the lettering less precise but no less intentional. It read, For Jonah, and for all the ones we couldn't keep. There was no ceremony, no dedication, just a few flowers tied to the side with a shoelace. Child's drawing taped underneath. Then another bench appeared, this time in front of a fire station in a dusty Texas town. The carving was shorter, just a name. And then the phrase that was beginning to echo across places that had never met, and for all the ones we couldn't keep. Within 3 months, there were nearly 50 churchyards, public parks, hiking, trails, school courtyards, all different, some carved carefully, others burned into the wood with branding irons or wood-burning pens. One had been painted in bright colors by a group of 4th graders. Another stood beneath an old oak, surrounded by stones with initials painted on them. No central organization led the movement. No one claimed it as a project or tried to monetize it. The benches simply showed up, one by one, carried by hands that had held grief too long in silence. Communities started placing weatherproof boxes nearby, like the one beneath Caleb's bench. People left letters, poems, notes, scribbled in crayon. Local newspapers picked up the stories. A bench for the unspoken. One headline read, "Grief finds a seat. Some towns tried to catalog them, but the list kept growing faster than it could be maintained. What mattered most was what didn't change. They were all quiet, no loud plaques, no spotlights, no garlands of flowers, unless someone brought their own, no scheduled vigils. Just stillness, just space." Back in Dry Fork, the original bench remained unchanged. Trevor didn't speak about the others. He didn't need to. But once, walking past the post office bulletin board, he noticed someone had pinned a photo of a bench in Oregon with a sticky note beneath it. It started here. He stared at it for a long moment, then nodded once before walking away. Martha, still making her rounds in the park, noticed more visitors these days. Not tourists, not curiosity seekers, just people. Some sat, some didn't, some left things behind. One woman came with a small wooden box and buried it under a tree nearby. She never said a word. She only touched the bench once, then walked away. The town didn't try to stop any of it. They understood now. The bench didn't belong to them anymore. It belonged to everyone who needed it. And somehow, without speeches or fanfare, a boy named Caleb, who used to wave at strangers and ask questions, too big for his age, had become the reason people across the country were finding places to sit, to breathe, and to remember those they couldn't keep. The carving had become more than words. It had become a language, spoken not with mouths, but with hands. Hands that built, hands that carved, hands that grieved, and then offered space for others to do the same. It didn't begin with an announcement. There were no morning assemblies or guidance counselor visits, no social media challenges or posters stapled to corkboards. What happened in Dry Fork started like most real changes, do with something small. A whisper passed quietly between classmates and across sidewalks, unnoticed at first, but it carried weight, enough to shift the rhythm of a town that had been holding its breath for too long. One Tuesday morning, Mr. Halpern, the janitor at Dry Fork Middle School, found the trash bins at the edge of Walker's Ridge Park already emptied before he arrived. The wrappers had been picked up. The paths were swept clear of pine needles. He thought maybe the grounds crew came early, but when he checked with them, they said no, it wasn't them. 2 days later, he saw them, a group of kids, not in uniform, not assigned, just there. One had a rake. Another had a roll of garbage bags. A girl from 7th grade was using her hoodie sleeve to wipe down the slats of the bench. They didn't talk much, and they didn't look up when Halpern approached. He asked them gently what they were doing. The smallest one shrugged, just helping. The others nodded, almost sheepishly, but with a kind of steadiness in their hands that said, this wasn't a dare, it wasn't a punishment, it was something they'd chosen. Later that week, someone left a bundle of tulips on the bench. No card, no ribbon, just a quiet gesture. By the weekend, 2 more flower bundles appeared and a hand-drawn picture of a frog taped to the leg of the bench. The picture wasn't signed, but anyone who had known Caleb would have smiled at the choice. Kids began showing up in pairs after school. Some brought gloves. Some just walked the trail and picked up what others left behind. No adult told them to. There was no project grade tied to it, no extra credit. But something about the bench had become part of how the town understood itself. It wasn't just the park either. One morning, Martha, the groundskeeper, found her tool shed neatly reorganized. Everything in its place, tools wiped clean and laid out as if for inspection. On the workbench, a folded note read, "Thank you for watching. No name, the sheriff." Noticed it too. Fewer calls about spray paint. Fewer complaints about noise after dark. It wasn't that the teenagers stopped being teenagers. They still laughed too loud sometimes and dared each other to jump from the highest rocks by the creek. But there was something quieter running beneath it all now, a kind of hush that wasn't silence but respect. One afternoon, Principal Halloway found a group of students sitting in the grass behind the school. Not loitering, just sitting. At first, she walked over, worried there might be trouble. But as she got closer, she realized one of them was reading. Not from a phone, not from a textbook, but from one of the printed pages that had been placed in the box beneath Caleb's bench, the boy's own words. A letter he'd written, recited by a kid who hadn't known him at all. They stopped reading when they saw her, looked up like maybe they were doing something wrong. She just nodded. "Carry on," No one bragged, no one posted online. The story had spread without hashtags, without influencers. Just one whisper after another. Some kids heard it in the hallway. Others caught it on the wind walking home from school. It sounded different for everyone, but it always carried the same message. Pay attention. Something matters here. Dry Fork had always been a quiet place, but now the quiet felt fuller, not empty or forgotten, just ... intentional. Every so often, someone new would ask, "What's the big deal about the bench?" And the answer never came from one person. It came from the dozens of small ways the town had started to change. Bins emptied before sunrise, sidewalks swept clean after school, kind notes taped to lockers, pencils left for the kid who always forgot his. The bench didn't demand this, it never asked, but somehow it taught. And the lesson spread not through loud proclamations or grand gestures, but through the whisper that passed from one heart to another. We remember, and we care. The trail hadn't changed much. The same winding switchbacks cut into the slope like careful stitches. The same roots curled out from beneath the pine-blanketed soil. The same wind passed between the trees, brushing against coats and hair and memory alike. But Jack Rollins noticed things now that he hadn't before. The bark seemed rougher in places, the moss a little thicker where the shade held longest. Or maybe it was just that he was older, slower, more attuned to the quiet. He carried a pack not too heavy, just enough. Inside were 2 tin mugs wrapped in a scarf, a thermos of coffee that still steamed when shaken, and one more item, a small leather-bound book. Its edges were frayed. Some of the pages had been dog-eared so often that they'd folded into themselves like flower petals pressed too many times. Caleb's journal. Jack had found it weeks ago while sorting through boxes in the school archives where old papers went. When no one knew quite what to do with them, a teacher had slipped it into a donation pile by mistake, maybe thinking it was just another notebook. But Jack recognized the handwriting right away. Caleb's ES always leaned too far forward, like they were trying to race ahead of the rest of the word. His TS had no crossbars, just vertical lines standing proud and slightly uncertain. He had meant to take it up the mountain sooner, but life, as it always does, had its delays. A flat tire, a late freeze, a long day that turned into 2. But now, finally, Jack was here. The cabin emerged through the trees with the same quiet stubbornness it always hadn't painted wood. A sloping roof, a pile of firewood stacked with military precision. Smoke curled from the chimney in a steady thread. Someone was home. Jack didn't knock. He never had to. He just opened the door and stepped in. Stomping the snow from his boots as he entered, Trevor Wallace looked up from the stove, where something unremarkable simmered in an iron pot. He didn't smile, but he didn't frown either, just gave a nod and gestured with his chin toward the bench by the window. "You bring coffee? Or am I boiling pine needles again?" Trevor said, his voice the same dry gravel it had always been. Jack grinned and held up the thermos, only the finest. They sat in silence for a while, the way men do when friendship has outlasted the need for conversation. The mugs clinked softly as Jack poured. The scent filled the room, dark, bitter, grounding. Trevor glanced at the book in Jack's lap. That his, Jack nodded. Found it in a bin behind the school. Lucky I did. Trevor didn't reach for it right away. He took a slow sip from the mug, eyes still on the steam rising between them. What's in it? Mostly what you'd expect. Frogs, rockets, some drawings of fire trucks, a few poems that don't rhyme. One entry about how he thought clouds were just the earth exhaling. Trevor let out a breath through his nose, something between a laugh and a sigh. Jack turned the pages carefully, but there's this one part. Might be worth hearing. Trevor didn't speak, but Jack took that as permission. He read aloud, voice low and steady, "If I ever go away like, for real. Not just to grandma's, I hope there's a place where people can still say my name. Not in a sad way, just ... like I'm still in the story." The words hung in the room for a long moment. Neither man moved. Finally, Trevor reached out and took the journal. His fingers rough but deliberate. He held it like something alive. "I've said it more lately," he murmured. "His name feels less like breaking glass." "Now," Jack nodded. "That's what stories do. They keep things soft." Outside, the wind began to rise. The trees whispered. The snow, fine and dry, tapped softly against the window pane until the coffee cooled. Later, Jack would make the descent alone, the empty thermos rattling lightly in his pack. Trevor stayed behind, still holding the book. He didn't need anything else that day. The fire was warm, the mountains steady beneath. Him and Caleb's voice, written in ink, remembered in breath, was still part of the story. The school auditorium was filled with the usual shuffle of feet and murmurs of programs unfolding. Folding chairs creaked beneath grandparents and parents. Jackets were draped over chairbacks, and a faint scent of cafeteria coffee clung to the corners of the room. The winter recital was always a quiet tradition in Dry Fork, simple and modest. No glittering backdrops or elaborate sets, just students, one by one or in pairs, stepping onto the wooden stage to share what they had practiced for weeks. The younger kids had already performed. Laughter followed a group of third graders who forgot their lines but smiled their way through the song. A middle school choir had sung a version of Shenandoah, and the applause had been steady, polite, warm. It was the kind of evening where everyone knew someone on stage, and everyone clapped a little louder than necessary near the back of the room. Trevor sat in silence, arms crossed. He hadn't planned to come. It was Jack Rollins who had convinced him. Hood said, "You should hear what the kids are doing now." That was all, nothing more. Trevor had nodded and found himself in a seat before he could change his mind. As the final performances approached, a hush settled across the room. The principal, Mrs. Holloway, stepped up to the microphone and smiled. "Our final student is someone who asked not to be introduced," she said gently. "But they've prepared something special." She stepped back. A girl walked out, no older than 13. She wore a simple blue dress and held a violin that looked slightly too big. For her shoulders, her fingers trembled as she adjusted the bow. No one clapped yet. The room just waited. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The first notes came soft and hesitant, like a breath before a memory. A slow melody, familiar but unplaceable at first. Then a few people in the audience turned to one another, eyebrows raised. The melody deepened. A run of notes, stretched and aching, filled the space like a whisper. It was Caleb's favorite song. He used to hum it all the time, even when no one else knew what it was. A tune he had picked up from an old movie, or maybe from his mother's record player before she passed. No lyrics, just music. Trevor had heard it countless times, the boy humming it while building model rockets, while coloring at the kitchen table, while watching the snow fall. And now it was back, not as a memory, but as a sound moving through the auditorium. Everyone in the room at once. Some people bowed their heads, others closed their eyes. Trevor didn't move. He kept his arms folded tight across his chest, but his jaw clenched, and his eyes locked on the girl's hands, so small, so focused. By the time the song reached its quiet end, the room was still. No applause, not right away, just breath held. Too long, released slowly, respectfully, that the silence spoke louder than any standing ovation. When the clapping finally came, it was soft, gentle, not out of politeness, but reverence. People didn't cheer. They simply pressed their hands together like they were trying not to break something delicate. The girl bowed once and walked. Off stage, without looking up, Trevor didn't move from his seat, not even as the chairs scraped. Back and people began to gather their coats. Jack appeared beside him eventually, handed him his own jacket without a word. "I didn't know they remembered," Trevor finally said, voice low. Jack glanced toward the empty stage. They didn't forget. As they left the auditorium, Trevor paused near the doors, looking back at the stage one last time. It was empty now, but the notes still echoed, faint and lingering in the corners of the ceiling, in the folds of the curtains. Outside, the evening was cold but clear. The kind of night Caleb would have insisted on walking through without a coat, just to feel the bite of it. And somewhere, in the space between the stars and the snow-dusted trees, that quiet melody kept playing, not from an instrument, not from a recording, but from memory. And memory, it turned out, could still be heard. The trail had changed, not in its shape. It still curled around the same hilltop, still passed under the same crooked pines, and still opened into the small clearing that held the bench. But time had softened it. The gravel had thinned in places, letting wild grass push through. The one sharp smell of cut cedar had faded into something subtler. Touched by sun and rain and countless seasons, A young couple walked the path with their daughter, maybe 7 years old, maybe 8. The girl skipped ahead, holding a walking stick she'd picked up from the trail's edge, letting it clatter along the wooden rails. The mother pointed out a squirrel darting between branches, her voice calm, warm. The father trailed just behind them, a gray beard marking time across his face. A slow but steady gait suggesting knees that once worked better than they do now. They came into the clearing mid-morning, when the shadows were short and the breeze still carried the scent of damp leaves. The bench waited in its place, just as it always had, though the grass around it had been recently trimmed. A few fresh flowers rested at the base, tucked carefully into a small jar. The girl approached the bench first, leaning on the backrest and running her fingers across the engraved words. She sounded them out slowly, halting on the second line. For Caleb, she read, and for all the ones we couldn't keep. She turned and looked at her parents, her brows furrowed with curiosity. Who was Caleb? The father stepped forward. Resting a hand gently on the wood, he didn't answer right away. His eyes lingered on the bench, then on the horizon beyond it, the wide blue sky stretching out over the valley like a held breath. Someone who mattered, he said finally. The words came without effort, not rehearsed, but lived. The girl nodded, not asking more, but sensing that the answer meant something. She sat on the bench and kicked her feet gently, eyes scanning the treetops. Her mother joined her, pulling a small snack from her bag, while the father remained standing. Gaze fixed on the carving dot, years had passed since he'd last been here. The visits had become less frequent, not from forgetting, but from life moving forward. Grandchildren, volunteer, work, the stubborn ache in his back. But this bench had never stopped being part of the rhythm of things. He had returned every year, at least once, even if just to sit for a while and say nothing. The letters carved into the wood had faded slightly, but the depth of them kept the words sharp. They didn't need to be recut. They held nearby. The small weatherproof box still stood under the bench. The old one had rotted through, but the town had quietly replaced it, same size, same design. Inside were pages, some typed, some handwritten, new layers, new names. The box had filled and emptied many times over the years, the contents changing like tides. People still came. They still wrote. The man sat down next to his daughter and granddaughter, resting his hands on his knees. He didn't say much, but his silence wasn't empty. It carried the shape of things he remembered, things he no longer needed to explain. He remembered the early days when the vandalism had shaken the town, when grief had turned to anger and then into action. He remembered rebuilding the bench, not just the wood, but what it stood for. He remembered the night he carved those second words, and the way the knife had moved like it knew the path already. Most of all, he remembered the boy who used to hum when he thought no one was listening. The boy who believed that frogs were smarter than people, and that clouds were just the sky thinking out loud. The boy who had once asked if you could build a time machine out of cardboard and string. The girl beside him giggled at something her mother whispered, and he smiled, just slightly. They stayed a while longer, until the breeze picked up and the trees began to rustle with afternoon energy. The girl left behind a small pinnacone she'd decorated with marker eyes, placing it carefully next to the flower jar as they walked back down the trail. She turned once to look at the bench again. "I like it," she said. The father nodded. "Me too." And the bench, with its carved words and stories folded beneath it, remained in the clearing and changed, steady, waiting. Not just for Caleb, not just for the ones they couldn't keep, but for whoever needed to sit, to remember, or to ask a question with no easy answer. It was a place built by grief, but sustained by memory. And what it left behind was something harder to name, but easier to feel. A kind of quiet that welcomed you. A kind of quiet that knew how to hold things.